Bo Nickal is under the most amount of pressure at the upcoming historic UFC 300. Ladies and gentlemen, I know people are going to sit there and say, what are you talking about, man? That doesn't even make any sense. Bo Nickal's going to run through Cody Brundage. He's a minus 1350 favorite. He's that guy. His wrestling, the Penn State, the national championships, all those different things. And I like Bo Nickal. I have to tell you that all of those reasons are exactly why Bo Nickal is under some of the most pressure we have ever seen a fighter put under heading into a gigantic spotlight at UFC 300. Guys, I know people are all in that camp of that I'm in as well, that Bo Nickal is going to make this look relatively easy over Cody Brundage. Cody Brundage is a guy that we've seen some issues in terms of the being, when the adversity presents itself, it just doesn't seem to go Cody Brundage's way. He cannot be overlooked, though. Cody Brundage has finished 5-6 fights. Like, Cody Brundage is still a professional fighter inside the UFC. Now, granted, they're not going to give Bo Nickal some sort of dangerous matchup in a spotlight like this at UFC 300. But for all of the reasons we have all laid out there, does that not back up what I just said, that there is more pressure on Bo Nickal than anybody else? Could you guys imagine if Cody Brundage somehow goes out there and pulls this thing off over Bo Nickal? That would be one of the biggest upsets we've seen in the UFC. Not only that, Bo Nickal is clearly one of the golden child, kids, golden boys, whatever you want to call it, of the UFC at this point, right? We see every now and then, Dana in the UFC, they have someone they're trying to build. They have someone who has a specific it factor to them, that specific thing that Bo Nickal does have. And if you're wondering, what is that? I don't know much about Bo Nickal. I know he was at Penn State. He's a great wrestler, this and that. First of all, Bo Nickal is sensational. There's no doubt about it. Bo Nickal has some of the highest level American-style wrestling that we have seen. A guy coming out of the NCAA, transitioning over into MMA that we have ever seen. Like, Bo Nickal's not just some guy, he was a Division I wrestler and he's coming over into the UFC. No, like, Bo Nickal is him in terms of collegiate wrestling, ladies and gentlemen. Like, you're not going to find many guys that are more highly credentialed than Bo Nickal. But this is not a wrestling match. This is a fight. And Cody Brundage is a guy who, he does have wins. He is able to finish people. He does have legit power. He's a pretty big guy at middleweight. And I know that, Bo Nickal's probably, I assume he's going to go in there and steamroll Cody. But the point is, can you imagine if that doesn't happen? And this just seems like one of those things, guys. Like, I'm not saying that Brundage is going to win. But whenever we're so confident that something is going to happen, like we're going to see a dismantling of somebody, bad things tend to happen. Like, I'm not saying it always happens. I'm not trying to jinx Bo Nickal. I just think that it's crazy coming into this matchup, the amount of pressure that is on Bo. Now, the UFC would not put him in harm's way in this big of a spotlight. They see something here where they're like, they are like 99.9% sure that Bo Nickal wins this matchup. Like, as sure as you can get. Because Bo, not only is he on UFC 300, opening up the main card. Now, on a stacked card, the most stacked card of all time the UFC has ever put together, they're taking a guy who has 5 professional MMA fights, 2 UFC fights, none of them against ranked opponents, and they, as in Bo Nickal, is opening up the main card to this historic event. That tells you everything you need to know about the UFC and their plans for Bo Nickal. Now, why are they doing that? Well, not only does Bo Nickal have that it thing, but it's the audience and the fan base that Bo Nickal brings to the sport. He brings that collegiate wrestling, that college town vibe into the sport of the UFC. Bo Nickal has a very large following in terms of the wrestling community. There is a lot of people that like Bo Nickal for good reason. And I just can't help but sit there and say, this man has some of the most pressure we have ever seen put on a fighter heading into a matchup, because there's no reason that Bo Nickal should lose this fight. None at all. But the last time we saw something so lopsided, where everyone was so sure that Robert Whittaker was going to get through Dracus du Plessis, I'm not saying that this is that type of thing. This, to me, is a much bigger mismatch than that matchup. I'm just using the narrative prior to the matchup taking place was DDP almost stands no chance. Robert Whittaker is better everywhere. He's faster. He's got better striking. He's a better grappler. And look what happened. I'm not saying Bo Nickal loses. I'm just telling you right now There is more pressure on Bo Nickal than anyone else on this card. I understand that he should go in there and beat Cody Brundage. He should make it look relatively easy. But there's that little thing that says, what if that doesn't happen? Because the UFC clearly putting him as the main card opener on a historic card. They clearly see this guy as one of the biggest names and one of the biggest stars soon to be in the UFC. He's already a big name. I'm sure they have big plans ahead for Bo Nickal, but it starts and stops with a win over Cody Brundage at UFC 300. But feel free to comment below, guys, on if you agree with me, if you disagree. I just think that I understand. Like I said, I get it. That Bo Nickal, yes, he's probably going to win. But when's the last time we've seen someone who's this early into their MMA career with this big of expectations getting thrown into a position like this? Now, we've seen Khamzat burst onto the scene, which is maybe someone you could kind of draw comparisons to because they have the grappling and, they kind of burst onto the scene and they build a name for themselves kind of quickly. But this is also a little different because Bo had that name prior to coming to the UFC. But we've seen the UFC make some mistakes along the way in terms of throwing people in there with guys that are maybe a little bit too advanced too quickly. Like we saw Khamzat get thrown in there against Gilbert Burns. And this is clear. The UFC is not going to make a mistake like that in this big of a spotlight at UFC 300. But I want to hear what you all think down in the comments below. Do you agree with me? Like this video. Subscribe to the channel. I appreciate you all. See you next time.